ask questions as we go. You see the chat box, go ahead and just ask your questions. And I'm also going to ask you some questions, so we do want some feedback from you. So when you see a question on there, go ahead and comment on it and let us know your thoughts or your answers. On top of that, if you need continuing education credits, they're not giving out a certificate, but if you can do this for self-reporting purposes, if you need CPE credits for this. And you can follow up with me afterwards on my blog, learnsecurity.org, or you can send me an email at donaldh@Mays Associates. This is my contact information. If you have anything, normally I would do introductions, but because there's a lot of people on here, we're just going to keep it with I'll introduce myself. So my background, for 20 years, I've been IT auditor, auditing almost exclusively local governments. I have done some assessments for federal governments and some nonprofits. So that's where I'm coming from. I really understand where local governments are coming from, and that's the space that 90% of the work that I do is. So if you want to follow me on social media or LinkedIn, just go ahead and reach out, and that's fine. You can find some of my past talks if you're interested on my YouTube channel at Learn Security YouTube channel. Without that, I always like to start off with some questions. So this is a cyber risk management course. So what are some of your pain points? And I usually ask this question, and I know that some folks in here are IT folks, and so I got to talk to IT folks, but I also need to talk to management folks. And the management folks oftentimes have different pain points than the IT folks. I think the last time we did this class live, we asked people even within the same city, I got two different answers. What the city manager felt like their priorities were and what IT thought the city's priorities were. So that's kind of an important aspect. So if you have any of those comments, go ahead and put them into the chat, and we'll try to work those into the conversation as we go. One of the first things that I want to make sure going forward, because oftentimes we'll find that risk managers for local government, cities, or districts oftentimes don't know what to do about cyber risk. In other words, cyber risk is one of those areas. They're really good at understanding employee getting hurt at work type of risks, or accidents, or concrete not being leveled, and so people trip and then there's a claim. So they understand that type of risk. But more recently, cyber risk has come to the forefront, and city risk managers there's been a lot of training on how to deal with it. And it's not that it doesn't exist out there, it's just it's been primarily an IT thing. And one of the comments that I oftentimes get, I'm the auditor, I come in, hey, I'm your auditor, I'm here to consult with you, and I'm here about IT governance, and they'll say, oh, IT, they're down the hall. So unfortunately, what you find, even in the federal government side of things, when you talk to the business or mission owners of the city or the department, something IT related or anything that vaguely sounds technical comes up, it's like, oh, IT's down the hall. And the problem is, that's not the case, right? So we don't need to talk to the people down the hall. We need to actually talk to the business and mission owners and make sure that they understand that this IT risk that we're talking about is business risk. And that is probably more evident with ransomware today than in any other type of incident that's been in the past. For the most part, local governments in the past were not targets. Mostly because you didn't have data that people wanted. And if you were a target, I think one of the local governments had their website defaced with a Free Tibet sign or something along those lines. That goes back a few years. But those were the types of incidents that local governments were dealing with. And for the most part, those were just annoyances, but they didn't stop work from happening, right? They didn't prevent the finance director or payroll from processing payroll. Now that ransomware came out, we now know that IT risk is a business risk because it stopped operations, and it was very pervasive in those organizations that have been hit. And we all know that risk is money, right? If you get hit with ransomware, your insurance premiums are going to go up. If you get hit with ransomware, your bond rating may go down. All of these things cost money. So there's impact beyond just the amount of downtime that you might have. And so people sometimes don't know, and they say, well, I don't know. So what you don't know can hurt you, and I guess that's the point. Now, if I'm talking to IT folks, because I notice that there's some IT folks on the line, they understand this. They understand that there's a risk. One thing that we in IT, and I include myself in that, is that there's no IT class on like, how do you talk to executive management, right? Or how do you make sure that they understand what the risk is in terms of the business? But you don't get that unless you are taking specialized courses, usually when you start working on your master's degree or something like that. That doesn't really come up. So in a lot of cases, local government, they don't necessarily know the risk. And we've talked to at least 4 or 5 different local governments here in Northern California that were hit with ransomware. And when we talked to management almost consistently said either they did not know that there was a risk, or they did not understand that what the level of impact could be until afterwards. And they just had a vague notion that there's something out there called ransomware, and it cost the city of Atlanta a lot of money, right? That's kind of what their view on it. So what is the current situation? And the current situation that most local governments find themselves is almost a perfect storm. And what are the issues that we have found in GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, so the finance folks, the average amount of spending for a local government on cybersecurity is only 2% of the IT budget. Only 2%. So let that sink in for a minute, right? Out of all the money that you're spending on IT, delivering services, only 2% of it has been earmarked to cybersecurity. Now, in some organizations, to be fair, I don't know how accurate that number would be, but I think it's probably fairly close. In other words, there's a lot of IT items that are not necessarily labeled as cybersecurity that are cybersecurity, but that still isn't going to get us up to 50% or to a place where we're mitigating risk at the level that we want to mitigate risk, right? In addition to that, this year has been a special year, right? Including the state being on fire from everything. We also have this COVID pandemic going out. So we now have a remote workforce. And so the question was, before we decided that we were going to go to remote, because we didn't really have a choice and we didn't really have a lot of warning to do that, what kind of risk assessment was performed in order for us to determine, okay, one, going to a remote workforce means that our attack surface or the level of risk that we're going to have has grown. So the attackers have more ways to try and get into our networks now that we have remote workforces, and now we have everybody's home networks, or Starbucks if they're sitting at Starbucks outside, and on the wireless. So there's all this new area of risk that we haven't really looked at yet. And what kind of training did we give to those individuals to make sure that they understand how to avoid risky behavior when they're at home on a home network or when they are at Starbucks on that network? Did we give them any training? And for most local governments, actually most organizations, I didn't see that kind of training was happening, mostly because it kind of came up on us and we weren't prepared for it. So now some cities also find themselves in a revenue shortfall. So in other words, they're talking about spending cuts across all departments. Other cities have found that their revenues were not as impacted as they thought they were going to be. I just read a newspaper article the other day that one of our client cities, actually their revenue is coming in based upon their projections, but their projections were actually very conservative. So it actually worked in their case that there's no cuts that need to happen. The other problem is cyber criminals have not slowed down their attacks. during COVID, they've actually increased them. So since March, we've seen an increase in ransomware attacks. So from a risk point of view, talking risk, that means there's an increase, right? So the risk has now increased. What have our mitigation efforts, have they increased as well to be commensurate with that rise in risk, or have they not? And most of the time, IT folks are just worried about getting people remotely set up and keeping the lights on, not necessarily about thinking about what might happen tomorrow, right? And that gets my next point. As IT auditor, I see this all the time for local governments. Oftentimes, IT is being asked way too much. IT staff is actually usually overburdened. In other words, the amount of work that is required of them or asked of them puts them at the position that they don't have time enough to either to work on innovation, in other words, increasing the value that IT brings to the organization, or more importantly, mitigating those risks or monitoring what those risks are in order to respond, right? And here's a hard thing. If there is a revenue shortfall, how do you still prioritize cybersecurity during budget cuts? Because if there's budget cuts and then you get hit with ransomware, then it's just compounding the problem, right? It's like saying, oh, we're in a bad situation. Hurricane's coming for us. We don't have the money to deal with it. So let's just cancel our insurance. Well, that would make no sense, right? Because we understand that when that hurricane hits, we're probably going to have some kind of impact. And I probably shouldn't use hurricane as an example, and I don't want to use earthquake as an example because I think California's got enough issues right now without one of those. Knock on wood for all those people that are superstitious. Anyways, you'd almost think, talking to risk managers, for those of you that are risk out there, the likelihood of having another big incident seems like it would be small. But given this year, I'm not sure. I think this is like the culmination of some type of statistical anomaly. But so let's talk about cyber risk management, and let's talk about how you'd go through normal process of cyber risk management, and then let's apply that to the ransomware issue that we have. And that's what we're going to do in this first section. Next Monday, we'll do the next section where we'll talk about governance of information and technology. So what can you do to respond to it? Don't worry, I won't leave you empty-handed. I will give you information that you can take back to your town or your city or district and say, okay, this is what IT needs to work on. These are the things that we know are important for ransomware. But then also how cyber risk management should work so that in the future when something else happens, whether it be a pandemic or this, you know that you need to be monitoring for these things and need to be preparing for these things from the risk management point of view. So what we oftentimes find as an auditor, and again, I have like 100 plus cities that I've audited over these 20 years. And what I have found is that often cyber risk management is reactionary. In other words, even though the auditor says, hey, you ought to do these things, and I even have a mug back here somewhere that says, if at first you don't succeed, do what your auditor told you to do in the first place. And I like that mug because I've found that over the years, I've usually been the one saying, hey, you need to address these issues. Still finding that those local governments are not as quick to address those issues. And again, I think it's because for the most part, cyber risk has not had the big impact that it now seems to have. Well, it now does after all these slew of ransomware attacks. So oftentimes, cyber risk management is often reactionary. Not until something happens is there any effort to even try to implement it. On top of that, it's often focused only on IT security. So in other words, it's not, IT's dealing with it as best that they can, but it's not getting any traction from the city manager, city attorney, city risk manager, maybe finance director, administrative services director. That executive level within a city is not actually hearing the message. They don't see what impact this could have on their operations. And because of that, seems to be that there's no alignment between the business objectives of the organization and the IT security strategy. Now, for the most part, again, I've said that in the past, I've asked this question and I had city managers and IT staff from the same local government sitting in the class, ask them the question. And they both had different views on what was important. So obviously, one of the things we want to do is make sure that there's that alignment between the business objectives and our mitigation strategy, right, for cyber. So the first thing we have to do is, this is a great little quote I saw from Charles Trempler, basically saying that you can't deny, it's not, in risk mitigation strategy, denial is not one of the best strategies to do, right? If you just pretend like it doesn't exist, you stick your head in the sand and hope for the best, that's not going to protect you, right? And so a lot of people, I do audits all the time and everybody tells me, oh, our situation, we're good. Our IT people are really good. We're on top of it. Well, and that's why I always got this quote from Return of the Jedi from Darth Vader. The Emperor does not share your optimistic appraisal of the situation. And even as an auditor, from that point of view, I look at and see what most local governments have in place, and most of them have significant gaps. And because of those significant gaps, they're at risk. And we've interviewed a number of cities that have been hit, and we found out what controls they had in place at the time and which ones they did not, that are recommended from, like the Department of Homeland Security has a list, and MSISAC, which is a group of local governments that shares this type of information. They both had different lists of what you should have in place. And so we interviewed those cities to find out what they had in place and what they did not have in place. And we found that most of them had most of those controls in place, but a few key ones were not in place. And because of that, they became victims of ransomware. And so, and I'll give you the list and you can go through the list yourself and you can say, okay, check this off. Are we doing all of these items? Because those are the first things that you want to do after you leave this session, is have a talk with IT, or if you're in IT, have a talk with management and say, hey, these are the items that we need to have in order to avoid what's happened to Baltimore, Atlanta, 20 different school districts in Texas, 10 different cities in California. I mean, if we want to avoid that, that's what we need to do to put in place, right? So, and let's not be overly optimistic about it. So in this first section, we're going to talk about that risk management. We're going to do it from that case study point of view. And then in part two, we're going to talk about governance of information and technology, and we'll talk about how that relates to cybersecurity management and how that relates to cybersecurity standards. I'm not going to cover everything about governance, but you'll see I'm going to focus mostly on the risk mitigation side of the house there. But you will want to stay tuned for part two, because you may not be able to sleep after part one. So anyways, so cyber threat management. So there's a basic, very easy, this is at a high level of understanding of the normal process of cyber risk management. So if you're going to do any type of risk assessment, or you want to figure out, okay, how likely is X to happen to our city from a cyber point of view, you need to have some type of threat intelligence, right? You have to have something. Insurance companies have a lot of actuarial tables. So that's great for some of the stuff, but a lot of these insurance companies do not have actuarial tables yet that are accurate enough for us to predict with any level of reliability what the impact of a cyber incident could be. Because a cyber incident could be anything, the same action that leads to one computer being taken down for an hour is the same action that could lead to the entire city being taken down for months. So unfortunately, it's very difficult, one, because the potential impact ranges so wildly from what could happen to what the potential is, that sometimes it's very difficult for us on a risk side of view to say what the impact actually is. But we're going to have to kind of come up with something, right? So some people look at do the worst case scenario. Other people say best case scenario. Someone said, most people say do it somewhere in between. You know, let's look at the impact as potentially being within this range, and maybe even just communicate what that range might be. We have to know what the threat landscape is. So what's going on? And I already gave you some of the information out there. if you were doing risk assessments in cyber risk for your local government, I just gave you some key information that you should probably write down, and this should be a part of your assessment from the threat landscape. 1, ransomware attacks are up. 2, the cost of them is going up. It affects things like your bond rating, insurance premiums, all those things get hit. In addition to that, the threat actors are becoming more aggressive about it. So those are things, and cities are still being attacked. And in fact, the increase in local governments, it's increasing in local governments. So what is going on? And sometimes you have to pay attention to that just through the news and media, but unfortunately you can't rely upon, the local news. You're gonna have to look at specialized news sources that deal with cyber risk. And those types of things. That's one location to get that type of information. Department of Homeland Security is supposed to be giving that information out, but it's few and far between. It's not adequate enough for us to actually make day-to-day decisions. So we have to know who the threat actors are and what they're doing. What are they up to? There's been a change in some of their tactics lately. That's another thing that we might want to understand is like, not only are they attacking and then launching ransomware, but now they're threatening, if you don't pay, to release the data, right? And most of the stuff in local government is probably not an issue unless they got into some HR information or they get into some other information that may make the city look bad. And we have to think of risks related to reputation. I'm sure if there was a big data dump, even if the information was, relatively benign, in other words, not a big impact, the impact from city council or from the citizens who find out that their information had been leaked may actually have a bigger impact. So we have to look at those types of impacts too. We can't just look at things from this point of view of how much downtime something was. So what are our vulnerabilities? So where are the holes within our system or our processes? Oftentimes when we talk about vulnerabilities, we're talking about a technical vulnerability. A patch was not applied to a machine. Great, but what about the vulnerabilities of process? A good example of a process that typically has a vulnerability is that when somebody leaves the organization, the process is HR notifies IT, IT then removes them preferably before they leave at the end of the day, right? So right away, as soon as that person is no longer working for the city, their system is turned off. What the vulnerability typically happens is because that process is a manual process, the vulnerability is the HR folks neglect to tell IT in a timely manner. So that becomes a vulnerability. So how can you fix those type of things? Obviously, in that example, an automated process may help alleviate that potential. So those are the types of things we need. What is our exposure for that? And then we have to look at likelihood and potential impact. So how likely is this to happen? Well, I just told you that ransomware is up, local governments are a target, it's increasing. So the likelihood is going up. It's not going down, it's going up. And what's the potential impact? Well, the impact is going up as well, right? Because they're asking for more of a either ransom or they're actually looking to make the damage more extensive than in the past. So the potential impact is the whole city can be down for up to maybe a month until critical core functions get back up and running, and then taking up to 6 months from some local agencies to actually recover everything. And some local agencies have lost data that they are never going to be able to recover. So those are the things you kind of have to take a look at and say, okay, that's a potential impact. What are we going to do if all of our permit system was gone and the backup didn't work, and now we have to either recreate all those permits, and how would we recreate those permits? And if we couldn't, how would we function going forward? So that becomes a lot of really, that obviously each city would have to deal with those types of things if that was the impact. And then mitigation. Now that you know all this, how are you going to respond to it, right? And for the risk managers out there, this is all basic, very basic. But we're talking about this in the cyber side of things. Right. So what are some great sources that you can do? Obviously, I said the news works. Industry groups probably a little bit better because they will give you information that you probably won't be able to find anywhere else. Vendors like Microsoft will put out, as soon as they know that there's a vulnerability, they will put out a notice for it. The CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, part of DHS, they will actually release vulnerabilities and advisories on a regular basis. And if you don't have them, you should sign up for them so that you can get those and know what they are. Although if you're not in IT, you may not want to sign up for it because you'll get like 50 a day, and it will fill up your inbox. Insurance groups, hopefully they can give the information. And the California Joint Powers Risk Management Association is having a class for you. So there's another great place that you can get information from, right? There's MSISAC, which is a multi-state information sharing organization for local governments and state governments. You'll have all kinds of federal advisories that I kind of mentioned, the Federal Trade Commission, FBI, the CISA, and the DHS, among all of those that have advisories that you can follow up with. And I will show you some of those advisories, and I will show you that in many of you have a local government, you may also say, hey, we were a victim of that, and this advisory came out 2-3 years ago. Why didn't we know about it? Why didn't we address it? Well, if you don't know that there's an advisory coming out, and then how can you address it, right? This goes back to that statement, pretending like it doesn't exist, or not knowing what it is, can really hurt still. So consultants, auditors also, all there to help. In fact, I have many of my clients will call me on a regular basis and say, hey, we heard about this. What do we need to do to address this, or how should we mitigate this? And as an auditor, I'm completely happy helping you, because when I do an audit, I want you to have a clean audit. I don't want to come out there and find a whole bunch of stuff. And it's not just because I don't want to write a really long report. There's that too. But the other thing is, I view my job as an auditor is to be there to help, right? To help you get to a better place, to have better mitigation strategies so that you're not going to be a victim of any of these ransomware or cyber attacks that are out there. So I just added this slide because I just saw this just came out the other day. So I want to do this because it was really interesting. So the former CEO of the UK's National Cybersecurity Center said ransomware needs to be treated as a disruptive threat, not like data theft or espionage. So in other words, what he's trying to say is that when we try to respond to these different cyber threats, different types of threats require different types of mitigation and a different type of response. And then one of the gentlemen that was writing an article about what the CEO had said, Steve Ranger from ZDNet, said tough decisions need to be made in order to stop ransomware. And by tough, he means it's going to be technically hard to do for local governments, and it's going to be expensive. But it's going to be big and difficult changes, in other words, and difficult in the way that it may cost money. And we'll talk about some of those items as we go. But keep that in mind, that this is still a significant threat that we need to address. So what are our inputs? So I just kind of told you where you can get some of this information, right? But there's other areas that we can get it, not just news, not just industry advisories that come out. But if your objectives change to your organization, in other words, if Parks and Rec decides they're going to do some kind of new classes and they never had classes before, that's a change in the mission of the organization. That change then may introduce new risks, and we need to ask the questions, what risks are related to doing that on the cyber side of things, so that we can address those. A good example of that, and this is one that I use often, Parks and Recs decides we want to go to an online registration system for our classes that we give. They don't involve IT or very limited involvement from IT. They may even know that they should ask that there's a compliance requirement for accepting credit cards called PCI, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And so they may know that, and they may ask the vendor, hey, is your application PCI compliant? And they may say yes. And then Parks and Rec will go through the whole entire process. They'll purchase the software and the system. They will place it into operations, not knowing that when you put it into a network, it ceases to be PCI DSS compliant unless the entire network is also compliant that you put it on, right? So that change in objective, there was no risk management done other than one question was asked. And because nobody on staff knew what the implications were, they then found out when they hire somebody like me to come in and look at it saying, oh, well, did you know that there's this other way that you could have avoided all of that? It's just a simple selection and may cost you a little bit more in the implementation phase. But because you looked at the risk before and mitigated before, it would have saved you hundreds of thousands of dollars. The city that I'm talking about, which will remain nameless, of course, they still don't have the network PCI compliant, nor do they have a strategy, but implementing that strategy to try and take and bolt on security after the fact is very difficult and costly, much more costly than if the decision at the beginning had been made to mitigate risk to the lowest level up front. Anytime the system changes, in other words, anytime there's a change in IT, which if you pay attention, IT changes daily. Every day there's a change in risk, right? The question is that a material change in risk or an immaterial change in risk? And the question is, who's asking those questions, right? Who's asking, like, okay, there's new vulnerabilities. Oh, we got a new system in here. What are the new risks? And how are we going to make sure that those risks are mitigated? Incidents. If you had an incident, if you've been a victim of ransomware, then you can know, oh, wow, right, there's an incident. What did we do wrong? And how do we correct it so it doesn't happen again in the future, right? So those incidents can become input into this process of, okay, we guessed that we thought that we were this likely to get hit. It turns out it was much more. So do we have any assessments? Do we ever do assessments on IT to see if IT is doing following some type of industry standards? So how do we know that they're following industry standards? And I don't mean to be, and this is not to disparage IT in any way, shape, or form, because that's where I'm coming from, but there's this idea of trust but verify, right? The whole point in having financial audit is not because you don't trust the finance officer, but it's a trust but verify, right? You want to make sure that people that don't understand the financials can rest assured that the financials are accurate, right? That's why you have a financial audit. The public can be happy about it. The city manager and council can be happy about it because they know, okay, somebody else independent looked at it. Same thing's true with IT, especially for people, city managers, most of them do not have an IT background. Most risk managers, city attorneys, finance people even, may not have an IT background. So how do you know whether or not it's adequate or not? Well, you can ask IT, but they're going to say it is, because there's just bias that everybody has. You ask me if I think our network here is secure, I'd say yes. Well, I probably wouldn't, but most folks are going to say yes, it is. So the question is, do we have that third-party independent assessment that happens on a periodic basis? And if you have internal auditors in your city, you may be able to use them to do some of this. But again, for them, internal audit, IT auditing is a new concept, and so many of them are not necessarily familiar with it. And then what happens if you have IT controls and they fail? First of all, are they being monitored? Two, if they failed, what are you doing to correct them? Right? So all of this becomes input. And here's a couple different inputs that you can see. This one came out in 2018 in July. This one says business email compromise. It was hitting $12 billion scam. I can't even tell you how many local governments, because actually this has been a bigger hit than ransomware for most, but the impact has been less monetarily. But almost every local government I know has been attacked this way. And many of them, I probably say about 50% of them, have actually had some type of compromise. One example is someone got an email from someone claiming to be the city manager, wasn't the city manager, asking somebody in the accounting department, whose job it normally wasn't to do this, to send all the W-2s to them because they were in a meeting and they needed to have the W-2 information in order to continue their conversation or whatever it was. And the person actually sent all city staff's W-2s to an unmarked email address that wasn't the city manager's email address. So when's that happening? Well, the folks in the city there were talking about, looking at possibly legal action against the city for that incident. And again, that happened after this advisory had come out, right? So there's been an advisory saying, hey, there's stuff going on out there. You need to kind of watch out for this. And the reaction was, oh, well. Oh, or the reaction was, I didn't even hear about it because I don't know about these things. So who in your organization is monitoring any of this, right? Next thing, CEO fraud. Again, this is the type of business email compromise, which I kind of just talked about. One tech giant, so in other words, you would think the tech giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all those folks, that they would have their act together, but yet they still fall for those things, right? And one of them in particular fell for $100 million. Now you say, well, local government's not going to hit for that much. Actually, I've had a few local governments that were hit in the millions. In other words, a wire transfer was made in the millions for local governments because they thought they were making a payment either to another government entity or they thought they were making a payment to a contractor for work that was done. We even had one instance where the local government, somebody in finance got an email saying, hey, we want to change we want to set up our direct deposit information or our ACH information so you can do wire transfers. And the city was just ecstatic because this, contractor in the past has been reluctant to take wire transfers. They always wanted to get a check. And of course, there's more work to do when you do that. So what they found out is the city staff did not even think to contact the individual to say, they just got an email that said it was coming from them. And so they just accepted it because they figured that that's what they wanted to do because the city had been asking them to do it. In addition to that, some of these criminals actually get into the email accounts of one or both sides of the issue and then hide emails within people's email boxes in order to come up with some fairly elaborate scams and actually been fairly successful doing so. Because then the email does come from that other person's email address, but it wasn't that other person sending it. So then the question becomes then who's going to be liable? So the city attorney gets to deal with that question. Are we liable because we relied upon information from an email that actually came from the client's system or the contractor's system because the contractor didn't have cybersecurity in place such that their accounts were not compromised? So there's a lot of questions that come up with that, right? But almost all of these, there's social engineering involved. And what we've even found is that some of the criminals actually get the information that is included in the email from city council meetings. So this is a really interesting thing. Like one city council meeting talked about the appointment or the someone was giving another promotion. So it was talking about the city council meeting. It was like just an announcement type of thing saying this person has been selected and is now being transferred to this position, blah, blah, blah. It was just more of a, this is what's going on type of thing. No real information in it. But that person within a week got an email from someone claiming to be city manager saying, congratulations on the promotion. Could you do me this favor? Right? So that was an example of them actually doing intelligence on their target. They would have to have watched that video in order to craft the email to send to get somebody to respond to it. And that's how far they're going. One thing that the criminals know is that cities have some money and they understand that getting them to do a wire transfer, something like this, has been fairly easy. And so the increase, because there have been so many that have fallen for it, whether or not it's information that shouldn't have been disclosed, like social security numbers on W-2s, or whether or not it's actually asking for a wire transfer. In either case, those cyber criminals are able to use that information. And there's been advisories about this, and it's been in the news quite a bit. They also attack your employees and try to get your employees to re-sign up or change their direct deposit information, try to get the information so they can then log into the system that you have for employees and then change it for the employees. Cyber criminals are trying everything that they can get into. They even have people contacting tech support. They're pretending to be tech support and calling it. I got a phone call. And I'm the head of IT for Mason Associates. We got somebody claiming to be an employee of ours who was calling as tech support to help. And I'm like, you're not on my staff. They even went so far as to set up a fake LinkedIn account with their name and associated to our business as an employee of ours. So this is how elaborate the hoax are. So you kind of have to watch out for those types of things. Staff is willing to fall for it. I already talked about W-2 ones. Again, a lot of these came out in 2018. I talk about some of the scams with the ACH and the direct deposit for employees in my blog. Not that you have to follow my blog to find out stuff, because I don't post as much on that stuff. But in other words, there's information that you can use out there. Another big one for one of the cities that I went out and did some day of training for their staff. One of their staff had just said, I got an email back from them, like after I had done the class, that they had just got a phone call from the city manager, and the city manager was asking them to buy gift cards via text message. So somehow the person knows that they work for a city, has their cell phone number, then texts them and says, hey, I'm so-and-so, the city manager. Sorry to contact you on the weekend, but I need to get some gift cards by Monday because we want to do some awards. Could you go out and get some? I'll clear it with finance. Just go ahead and submit it as an expense, and I approve it. Well, great. So then what happens? Then the employee didn't, because they went to my class. The employee was like, wow, I got to tell Don about this one because he just told me about that in class, and then it just happens to me. Right? This is the type of thing we're seeing. So how are we getting that kind of information to our employees? Now, this one you may say, well, that's on the employee. The employee should have, checked on this and all this stuff. But if they fall for this, they're going to fall for something else where they click on something and gets it into your network, right? So we want to make sure that we're watching out for that kind of stuff. Now, every year, there's the Great Conference for Cybersecurity. I call it the Great Conference because it's like, that's the big thing, right? Depending upon if you're in city management, ICMA has a big conference. Everybody goes to that one, right? The RSA is like an industry-wide cybersecurity. Every industry's, every different verticals there, all about cybersecurity. It's the big thing. Everybody goes to San Francisco. It takes over the whole city for a week, and most people don't even know about it. Because if you're not in cybersecurity, most people aren't aware of it. But there's 20,000 plus people there, right? So it's a big deal. Almost every vendor comes out with some kind of report that tells you about the trends that they've noticed over the last years. I always look at this as, hey, that's good information. And I can get information about, like, this is an example of, and of course, this is from 2019, last year at this time. So it's a little bit dated. It's a year out of date. But I can use this information to kind of figure out, well, what kind of ransomware are they currently using? What kind of ransomware is out there? Because if I know how that ransomware works, then I may be able to address that in my system. Right. And if there's 5 different types of ransomware and 5 different types of controls I can put in place, I might want to focus on the big blue shape right here and say, okay, that's the one that I probably need to watch out for. This particular one comes from govinfosec, infosecurity.com. They also talk about, which is, I found this interesting, is what countries are being hit the most. Surprisingly, India and Indonesia are outpacing the United States for being hit with ransomware. So they have they may have a larger population, but they have companies that probably have less capital. In other words, they have less money to be able to pay for a ransom, but the impact may be more severe to them. So they may be more willing to pay lower ransomware. And if you think about it from a criminal's point of view, they think of it like a business. Some money is better than no money, right? And people have actually used that to their advantage and just basically went back to the cyber criminals and saying, you know, we can't pay you that much. We don't have that much money. Would you take $10,000? So they have the option of, one, getting nothing or getting $10,000. And so in some instances, they've actually accepted a lower amount. They're cyber criminals. They're not expecting necessarily. They're going to ask. But if you are going to negotiate with them, you should know that you know, other people have successfully negotiated lower terms. Not that you should negotiate with them, but if you do, then think about that. Also, they talk about the average amount that they're asking for. It's interesting that the different type of ransomwares that are out there, they ask for different amounts of ransoms, which is interesting because what that tells us about the threat actors is that a particular threat actor is using a particular tool or particular malware. Because if they're all asking very similar amounts from organizations, then they probably are the same threat actors behind it. And we've seen who some of the threat actors are. Some of them are nation state sponsored. And those are the ones that you're going to have the hardest time dealing with because there's one thing, if you don't know who the folks are, if you're going to negotiate and pay a ransom, it's a completely different thing if it is North Korea that you're knowing that you're negotiating with. In other words, we know that this particular ransomware is being used by Iran or North Korea. I'm sure you can ask the city attorney. There's probably all kinds of laws against negotiating with hostile nation-state enemies. And some of them are just backed by cyber criminals. And again, FBI at one point in time had said, do not negotiate with them, do not pay the ransom. And the FBI went back on that and said, we're not telling you that you should pay. We definitely would like you not to pay because if crime pays, it's only going to increase. So we'd prefer that you not pay, but we understand that you may have no other choice. If you have the choice between losing your data and not being able to ever recover or being able to recover, then they may suggest that you make the payment. Your insurance company may suggest you make the payment because it's going to be cheaper for them if you do. So all those things get taken into consideration. And as an IT cybersecurity person, I don't have an opinion on that, but you should know because management needs to make the decision, but they need to understand what that's going to cost. And that you're making it so crime pays, and if crime pays, then it doesn't stop, right? So you become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So what's the threat landscape? We talked a little bit about this before. One of the big anti-malware softwares out there, Sophos, the CPO said, we're seeing that despite the defenses as we put out there, the attackers are being more successful than we'd like to see. So that's not good news for us, right? The attackers are continuing to be very successful, and what are we going to do about that? You can look at the American Water Works Association. A lot of my clients that are districts, water districts and stuff, they're in this sector, and they have noted in their 2018 report that cyber risk is the top threat facing businesses and critical infrastructure in the United States. And so they said this is the top threat. This is in 2018. What I have noticed is some of the districts, and maybe it's because this report was out or whatever, they seem to have a maturity level a little bit above local governments, like cities and even counties. And part of it is critical infrastructure related, and there's a more of an emphasis on them. We don't want anybody like poisoning the water supply. We don't want people bringing down their systems and then not be able to deliver water to people's homes because that becomes a bigger issue, right? people have saw that it wasn't a cyber risk, it was a public safety risk. And even though it's a cyber risk, it is also a public safety risk. And they made that connection. And because of that, I think that that's why they may be in that better situation, or they have better defenses. There's a ransomware advisory that came out from the CISA, and they said that their recovery costs are topping $5 billion in 2019 as of last year, a year ago. So it wasn't even the end of 2019, and they were already saying it was going to cost $5 billion. And the federal government has made recommendations that everyone take immediate action. It's not very often the federal government says you need to take immediate action to safeguard against ransomware threats. So obviously, if it wasn't on our radar by now, it should have been. And if it still isn't on the radar of your local government, it better be. It really should be. Otherwise, you're going to see a screen like this, right? And so if you don't know what ransomware is, it's a malware that once it gets onto your system, encrypts your files and locks you out. So a good way to think about it, it boots your system. Like if you're parking and you get your car booted, this is basically what it's like. It just takes your system and locks it out, and you can't do anything with it. So most of them will encrypt all the files on your system and locks the users out of the system. And then it says if you want to be able to get back into your system, you have to pay a ransom, and they will give you the keys. Now, the question always comes up at this point in time. It's like, well, how often are they going to actually give you the keys if I do pay the ransom? Actually, it's pretty high. It's like 80%, I think, is what I've been hearing recently. So they are likely to pay. So if you're taking that into calculation, you have to understand you probably have a 20 to 25% chance that they may not give you back even after you pay. So you want to take that into consideration when you're doing this. And it's not a fun decision to have to make, so to speak. So now, this is the FBI's definition. You don't have to go through it. I just put it up there because, you know, here's an official definition of it. But it's just basically that email. It gets into your systems usually by somebody clicking on something in an email, opening an attachment or something, or clicking on a download. We now see that attackers are targeting Zoom meetings. Zoom has some security flaws in it, and if it's not set up correctly, anyone can what they call Zoom bomb it, or they can get into the meeting. People have been getting into those meetings and then putting a link in the chat for people to click on. People click on that link and boom, it hits their system. So those are the types of things we're seeing out there. Now that the pandemic's out there, it's making it a little bit easier because people in the past, every once in a while, would say, hey, Joe, I got this email from city manager. It says this. Do you think that sounds odd? And Joe might be smart enough to say, hey, that is probably odd. Don't click on it. You know what I mean? When they're working from home, they may not be able to do that. Just talk to the person over the other side. So is this new? Well, no, it's not new. It's been around since 1989. This idea of ransomware, in other words, software that locks your system out, and then you have to pay to get it done. Now, it wasn't very successful back in 1989. It basically required someone to send a floppy disk. If you're too young to understand what this is, sorry, this is an old type of way to transmit data in the old days, right? So you'd have this floppy disk, and it would send something, and somebody would be interested in it because it said AIDS on it. They're like, oh, this is interesting. I want to put it in my computer and find out about it. Because you have to remember 1989, that's when the big AIDS scare was out, right? So people would go in there, they would install it because, you know, it says go to the C prompt and install. So they would go to the C prompt and install it, lock their system out. Right. So this goes all the way back to 1989. So this is not a new thing. The problem is when they asked for the payment, they asked you had to give you had to go to Western Union and then send the money to another location. And most people, it was just too difficult to do. Today, this is completely changed. The demands are now done with cryptocurrency. Oftentimes Bitcoins, but there's other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin that allows anonymous payments. Nobody has to go in to pick it up. All all kinds of different, there's a lot of, plus it's easier to launder. So you can go through multiple systems. They have these, what they call washers, which basically just takes, there's a bunch of accounts. You put the money into these accounts and it just starts moving the money around constantly until it can't be found, and then puts it off into other accounts at the end that the cyber criminals have. And so what we also see with the ransom is that they don't ask for a lot of money up front in the scheme of things. And we could talk about that, what Atlanta was charged, what the Atlanta ransom was versus what they cost to recover from it is nowhere near comparison, right? So a lot of organizations will pay just to get their systems back because it's cheaper. And like I said, you can oftentimes negotiate the ransom, but paying ransoms encourages crime. So we want to be careful about that. So what do you need for Bitcoin money laundering? There's websites that will help them figure it out, right? So the bad guys know how to do all this stuff. So for them to launder the money, it's not a big deal. What we have found also is that when we look at top targets for these cyber criminals, it's local governments is one of them. And if you look at education right underneath it, most education is also local government. So number 3 and 4 are local governments, right? But they attack everybody. Hotels, they take a hotel and took out the key card access so nobody could get into their rooms. So the hotel thought, oh, well, we'll just assign everybody keys, you know, the old-fashioned keys. Well, when they did that, then the hackers took out their computer systems for booking. You know, so again, these attacks, if they're inside your system, they're still inside your system. Don't provoke them because then they may do something worse, like start erasing stuff or deleting things, and then you can't get anything back. So local governments are targets, so you can look at the news. It doesn't take long. There's a bunch of articles here, and I just put a bunch of them up here just to impress you with how many there are. But all these local governments get hit. A couple years ago, 2017, so this goes back 3 years ago. This is 2020, folks. December 2017, North Carolina County gets hacked. That should have been a radar to all of our cities saying, hey, what is this? We're normally not attacked by this. This is a new type of attack. We should respond to this some way, shape, or form, right? And they found out that the ransom was only asking for $23,000, which in the scheme of things for a county is probably not a lot of money. And it turned out it took them more than $2 million is what they expected the costs were going to be. I had not heard anything follow up on this county if it cost actually $2 million or exceeded that. But there was definitely a cost that they estimated to be about $2 million for the recovery costs for that. Florida got hit, city in Florida got hit, and then one of the city employees decided that they were going to pay the ransom just to get everything back up and running, and that person got let go. Terminated, I guess is the right word. Port of San Diego got hit. The interesting thing about them, they got hit at the end of 2018, but when they were hit with it, they had emergency services. So 911 for the Port Authority, their dispatch was hit. And the only reason why they were able to get that back up and running as fast as they could is because they had already purchased brand new computers, laptops that were sitting and had not even been taken out of the box. They were able to take those and deploy those in a different network to bring that system back up online. Otherwise, if they had not had that, then they would have to go out and purchase, requisition. It would have been a much longer recovery process. And after 6 months of recovery effort, they were still in the process of recovering all of the systems, right? So big hit. So big that Louisiana governor declared a state of emergency after an outbreak of local governments got hit with ransomware. Atlanta got hit with it. Originally, they thought the cleanup cost was going to be about $2.6 million, ended up costing $17 million. So that's a huge jump, right? That's not insignificant to anyone's, right? That's Baltimore got hit as well. So Baltimore, they got hit shortly after. This was in 2019, so we're talking about last year. And basically they were saying, hey, we're still reeling after a week and we're still not back up to, so how much do you think it cost them? $18 million. So now we got like this idea, at least in our head, that there is this idea that if you're a city about the size of Atlanta or Baltimore, which I think roughly they're about the same size, you could figure out that there's what's the recovery cost of that? 17 to 18 million. Both of those are very close numbers. And so statistically, I would think that you could use that kind of number if you wanted to look at impact if you were that size of a city, right? Or something close to that. Other local governments here got hit. Some of the cities that we've worked for or have done work for in the past, they've been in the news. And that's unfortunate. My point in showing this is that here in California, everything else I just showed you was everywhere else in the United States, but here in California, getting hit too. And I haven't updated the slide, but there's a lot of other cities that have been recently hit as well. Some of them were hit, but it did not take out all of operations. In other words, one department may have gotten hit, a few computers may have gotten hit, but they were able to recover, but they still got hit. It just, remember I said there's this impact from one computer or one department getting hit to the whole entire organization being out, right? So there's this spectrum of impact. These ones were a larger impact than some of the other ones I know, and some of those have not been reported to the news. So there's even more than what you know about that's out there as far as been hit. Their impact was just left. So threat landscape. So as are evolving their attack, they're becoming more sophisticated. They're targeting organizations. Profit is typically their motive. Although the North Korean hackers, even if you paid the ransom, they would not let you recover your system. So knowing who potentially it is, threat actors, some of the insurance companies, some of the larger ones know who the threat actors are. They've dealt with them before and other organizations have been hit, so they know whether or not they're going to pay or not. Relying on those folks may be helpful in those decisions. The problem is we're not keeping pace. Another problem that we have that's outside of control of all the cities is that talent and skills gap. There's not enough people in cybersecurity. The federal government came out with a report 2 years ago that there is a deficit of 2 million by 2020. There's supposed to be a deficit of 2 million cybersecurity professionals. In other words, we have 2 million unfilled jobs in cybersecurity. That was what their estimate was. And I haven't heard an update on that, but the only update that I heard was that it was getting worse, that we still needed more people. And so that should tell us something, right? In fact, some nations, India just announced the other day that they're going to start teaching IT skills in kindergarten and cybersecurity skills along with that. So they're doubling down in the future. Everybody needs to understand cybersecurity, and they're starting it day one in their education system. So that should be an indication to us. The federal government says, hey, we're trying to work with colleges to curriculum that'll help, get some people into cybersecurity, instead of going all the way back and say, okay, from day one, we're going to teach people not to click on things and how to discern whether this email is legitimate or not, right? We're still in that process where we haven't got that way. So that means that we have less skills necessary to deal with the increasingly sophisticated type of attacks that are arising. So threat actors, what do we got out there? There's a lot of bad actors out there. And again, a lot of them are far more organized than the city is. And here's an issue. In defense, you should not take away from this that IT staff is not doing their job. IT staff for your city has to get it right 100% of the time. The cyber criminal only needs to get it right once. Let's put that in context, right? We have to be 100%, no problems. And if they just find us once, they get into our systems, then they can bring our whole systems down. This is huge, right? So we are completely outnumbered. And if you have IT staff, and even if you have a sizable IT staff, there's still a lot more hackers than that out there. And if they're hitting cities as a target, then you are a target. So there's rounds coming down range, and you're right in the crosshairs, right? So what are we going to do? Now, there's not a whole lot that we can do against nation states. If North Korea wanted to hack into your system, they're probably going to hack into your system because they're much more sophisticated than the regular cyber criminals out there. We do have hacktivists out there. I somewhat surprised with all the riots that we had that we didn't have more of that. There seems to have been a little bit, but not a big rise in people like defacing websites and that kind of stuff, trying to make a political point. We didn't see as much of that going on. Cyber criminals, we have had for a long period of time, that one is still strong and in place. Their motive is profit, right? So we know what they're trying to do. Nation states, they just want to wreak havoc. They want to bring down systems. They want to attack our critical infrastructure. So if we have critical infrastructure, we may be a target of them. And then insiders. Insiders are always potentially a threat, and we have to take that into consideration too. Disgruntled employees. We've had disgruntled employees. There was it was in Australia. It was a sewage district, and the district didn't hire this person or didn't promote him, and so he hacked into the system and then turned the valves on to take raw sewage and just open it up and let it go right into the river, just because he didn't get the promotion or the job. So we have to be concerned and cognizant of those risks as well. We've had, there's been a rise in nation state attacks, and we've seen that, and you've probably heard a lot of stuff about election security right now. So not only do we have to deal with this ransomware and critical infrastructure being attacked, but also on top of that, there is a concerted effort to meddle in or somehow influence elections. Most of us local governments probably are not going to deal with that aspect of it. In other words, they're going to be more concerned, more targeting the voting infrastructure. That's what they're targeting. That's the area that we probably need to be more concerned about. Them hacking into news sites and planting fake stories on legitimate news sites, that's going to be something that is outside of our control, right? But those are the types of risks that we're facing now. So what we found is that the cybercrime is much more organized. There used to be this idea that a cyber criminal, and I always ask audiences, like, when you think of cyber criminal, what do you think of? And I get all kinds of answers like, some guy eating Cheetos, drinking Dr. Pepper in his mother's basement, right? That's the typical idea of what some people think of hackers. You need to think more along the lines of like The Godfather, right? Because it's more like organized crime, very sophisticated and very far-reaching, with more of a mentality of, how are we going to make money, and then having all kinds of other individuals working for central people. So it's no longer like this one person trying to hack into your system. It's a whole team of people. And that team grows and shrinks over time. There's a lot of hackers that will give their skills to one of these hacking groups to get money. And they like it because they don't get as much of a payday, but they definitely get a payday. And one of the issues that we're also finding is when people find out, or if they're unemployed, they can use their programming skills to hack, and then they may go out and try and make money that way. So what are their trends? It used to be they're very indiscriminate, and they still kind of are. It's like a shotgun approach. Who's going to pay more for your data than you? Nobody. So why try to sell the data they get from you on the black market? First of all, most of what a local government has is not going to be something anybody's going to pay for on the black market. But if they can lock your system out, you're going to pay for your data to get it back, right? So now they figured out a way to get paid, right? And they also, and from a business point of view, you like return customers, right? So they like to hit victims multiple times. Either because the victim didn't pay the first time, so they hit them again, or if the organization paid, they may wait a year and then hit them again. Meanwhile, maybe hiding in their systems the whole entire time, right? Because we thought we got them out, but they're still in there, hiding in camera systems, printers, phone systems. They will hide wherever they can hide. They were found in a TV monitor that was used in a conference room, had been hit with ransomware, but didn't lock it out. But that's where that ransomware hid in their network and then launched another attack after they had thought they'd cleaned them all out. But luckily, one of the tools that they got was a monitoring system that monitored the network and was then able to see anomalous behavior coming from the TV monitor and then lock it out. But then we found out that that's where, once they got in the first time, they hid themselves in there, locked the organization's network out, asked for the ransom, didn't get the ransom. Those folks cleaned it out, but then launched the attack again because they were still inside the network. So things we got to watch out for. There's a lot of different types of things they do. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because I don't want to run out of time, but also just to let you know that they can do things like cryptojacking, they can steal data, they could do all of the above, and there's some instances where they do it. But let's look at their mentality because, from risk management point of view, we have to understand them. If they do a data, they have to take the information. One, they have to get into your system. Two, they have to take the information and get out without you noticing it. And some firewalls may be able to see some of this information going out, and so it may trigger a response. But once they get it out, they got to find interested buyers on the dark web to sell the information to. Now, if you're Equifax, then you got a lot of information that people want to buy because then they can use that as identity theft. So look at it from a cyber criminal's point of view. There's a lot of work they have to do, and then they have to sell it afterwards, right? Ransomware, what do they have to do? All they have to do is get into your system, lock your system out, and then convince you to pay them to give them information back. This is a lot less work for them. And from a profit motive, it can be just as lucrative, if not more, because you don't know if people are going to buy stuff on the dark web. With so many data breaches that have happened, the information that's out there may already be out there. Right? So getting people to pay for it is a bigger thing because you have to have a market for somebody to do it. Those people who buy that information, they have to turn that information somehow into money for themselves. Right? So there's usually, it's a bigger chain of events in order for people to get paid out. And there's a lot of variables. A lot easier with ransomware. Cryptojacking is even less work. All they have to do is break into your system and then turn your system into basically, it turns it into a mining, crypto mining machine. So they put the malware on it, and then basically what it's stealing from you is your compute power. In other words, your computer sitting there idle, not using all of its resources. They then put those resources to use to mine for Bitcoins, and they make money that way. This one is probably the least impactful to you. You'd probably say, oh, we got cryptojacked. No big deal, take the software off and then you're back up and running. No real big impact on the organization, except for the fact that they were inside your network. If they were inside your network, what else did they do? That's what the worrisome part is. So even if they did this, it's more of a concern. A lot less work for them, they can do it. They oftentimes will jump into websites, take over a website because it's usually outside of the organization's network anyways. The combo attack, which is a new thing. What do? They will get in there and do all of them. They'll breach your data, they'll set up a ransom, and while you're debating whether you're going to pay the ransom or not, they hijack your machine to mine for Bitcoins. So we've seen this like combo attack method out there as well. So most of the cyber criminals are money motivated. However, nation states, if they're sponsoring it, it's really based upon destruction or destabilization. In other cases, very weird, strange bedfellows might come from this. In other words, cyber criminals are trying to make money, maybe supported by another nation state, because that does add to destabilization, although you may get your information back because now we got 3 people involved. The nation state is helping the cyber criminals to run the attack because then that puts them at an economic advantage over us. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on too that we have to watch out. So they will do whatever they can to increase the likelihood they're going to pay. Think about it from a business point of view. For criminals, that's the way they're looking at it. What can they do to get you to pay? If they can hit your backups, you're more likely to pay. So your backups are definitely a target. In fact, it'll probably be the first thing they will try to target. If your backups are online, in other words, accessible to your network at the time that they launch their attack, they're going to try to attack those first. And the reason for that is if you have no backups, you can't recover something. If you can't recover something, you are much more likely to pay. They make reasonable demands for the most part because it encourages people to pay. They will even give you a sample and let you decrypt one of the systems before they give you all the keys for all the other systems, right? So that you can see that they're, they have good intent and that you can recover this stuff. So we're starting to see those type of things. They have a whole customer service mentality as well, again, to encourage you to pay. And they like any other opportunities. Again, if they can add a data breach and a cryptojacking to it, make money off of both of those as well as the ransom, they will do it. So where the money is where they go. It's market driven. If you pay the ransom, then that's where they're going to spend their time and money. So more people pay the ransom, the more likely we all are to be targets. So just to give you an idea of the anatomy of attack, they get into your system, they hide in their system, they move around while they're inside your system, your network, your computers and all that. They stay inside of it and then they execute their attack. So most of them, in some cases, we found that people are inside of, hackers are inside people's systems for up to 6 months before anyone knows that they're in the system. And that's the industry average. The industry average, that means there's people a lot longer than 6 months and people less than 6 months, obviously, to get the average. But the average is 6 months that they're inside your network with knowing before you notice that there's something happened or they attack. So what are they doing 6 months? They're doing reconnaissance, they're moving around from computer to computer, they're eavesdropping on conversations, they're getting into people's email files, they're getting into all of that kind of stuff, and they're just roaming around, trying to find out what type of information they can have. Mind you, they're probably hacking other people too, so they're not spending 100% of the time doing it, but they may have some automated tools that are in the process of trying to take over other systems. So how do they get in? Mostly social engineering, some type of email we call phishing, where it pretends to be something it's not. Sometimes from the browser, unpatched systems, remote access, and now with everybody doing remote work, remote access is going to be a bigger concern here. And then obsolete software and services. So you have those old systems. If you're still running any Windows 7 machines, don't. If something is obsolete, the software is obsolete, that means it's no longer being patched or serviced by the vendor. It is a prime target. So those types of systems need to be out of the system as soon as possible. And there needs to be planning before they get to the point that they're obsolete to be off of all of them before it gets to that point. They like to hide in your network. Talked about it, average is 180 days, 6 months. And they will hide their code in low priority systems like that TV I was telling you about. And they usually encrypt the traffic so you don't know what the traffic is. So IT folks don't necessarily, it looks like normal traffic, in other words, on the network for them. Moving around inside your network, once they're inside of it, part of it's reconnaissance, part of it's finding other systems to infect, find out where the backups are so they can target them. And make it so that you can't recover from those. And if they're in there for 6 months, they have plenty of opportunity to do those things, right? They evade detection. The idea is they run silent, they run deep, like the old movie about submarines or whatever. They try to get inside there and really hide from you so that you just don't know where they're at. And again, they can then, from those other low priority systems, launch future attacks. And also, while they're staying in there, what we sometimes call dwell time inside your network, they use that as their time to look for those backups and do it. And they also like to hit you more than once. If they're already in there and they hit in there, then they can hit you again in the future. And then they will execute at some point in time where you will find out that, oops, we are hit. And they were going to try and hit the business critical systems. They, in order to get you to pay, they're going to try and make it hurt as much as possible. You know, when the bullies at school would grab your arm and put it behind your back and make you say uncle or whatever. I guess they don't do that kind of thing anymore. But you know the idea, right? The more you make it hurt, the more likely they're going to give in. And that's the whole idea here. They want it to hurt as much as possible to get you to pay. And so that's what they're done. So recently someone was hit. They were hit with malware. It's a version of Raikou, hit 3 times. They hid in the phone system, took months to resolve. They needed outside support. Management had a vague notion of the threat, and they did have insurance. So they were able to recover from that. But this is the type of thing that we should be looking at as a potential impact for any of our local governments, right? So what's the exposure, right? So even after a year of ransomware, after Atlanta was hit with ransomware, the city still had vulnerabilities. In other words, they still did not have what they needed in place as far as controls mitigation efforts were still not in place. And they didn't have the necessary personnel that had the skills or the mindset to combat those. So management was still working with the assumption that, well, this is an IT problem, they need to deal with it. And IT still did not have what they needed in order to protect the system at the level it needed to be protected. And that's a year after. So even if you get hit, doesn't mean that necessarily your vulnerabilities are going to be all gone. And what we have found that about half of the ransomware victims that are hit multiple times because those vulnerabilities, the ways that people got in, were not addressed. It's not just about recovering. And some people think, well, you just recover the system and then we go on our merry way and everything's going to be good. No, once hit, you're more likely to be hit again. So what does that mean? You need to find out all the holes in your system and they all need to be patched, figured out, whatever they are. And remember when I said vulnerabilities, I'm not just talking about technical vulnerabilities on a system, but like a vulnerability in a process. So those are the types of things that we can do. Now, some people say, well, let's just put some antivirus software on our systems, you know. Well, here's the thing, it doesn't actually help. Well, it does help. I don't want to say it doesn't help, but even if you have anti-malware on your systems and it's up to date and performing as intended, guess what? You can still be a victim of a data breach. So Verizon makes one of the good reports that I recommend that everybody read on an annual basis. They come out with it annually, usually around the time that RSA conference is going on. And one of the things that they had found in the 2018 data breach is that 93% of the data breaches are linked to some type of phishing or social engineering. So in other words, how they get into your system, it's usually related to some type of email that was sent to somebody, or somebody got a message via their phone. There's a bunch of different ones. In fact, under social engineering, you may have heard of phishing, but there's one called vishing, V-I-S-H-I-N-G. That one is voicemail based phishing. Someone calls in and says, oh, I'm from tech support. Your account's going to get locked at the end of the day. I need to help you reset your password. Give Port a call at this phone number. So you get those type of thing. I've taught my mother very well. She got a phone call from somebody. No, she called because she was having a hard time getting her internet to work properly, or something wouldn't connect to the internet. Anyways, so the guy said, well, you need to upgrade the system. And she knows better than to listen to anybody on the thing. So she calls me and says, this guy's telling me I need to do this. So can you come over and deal with it? So her response is, her mitigation is, if anyone asks her to do anything on her system, I've scared her sufficiently enough that she's going to call me and ask me to help her with it. Which is bad for me, but it's good for her because she doesn't have to worry about it now. She's just like, nobody touches my system except for my son, and we're just going to let it go with that. We have spear phishing. Now, this is the more likely the type of phishing you're going to get, and that is where it's tailored. The phishing is tailored towards your organization. This is where they case the joint, right? You know, in criminal terms, they got to case the joint, kind of figure out where the weaknesses are, and then attack. So spear phishing is the same type of thing. They look at your website, they figure out who's in charge of who, look at the org chart, you know, find out all this stuff. What's the name of the city manager? Well, that's going to be everywhere, right? They'll then use that information to launch their attack. So it seems like it's legit. You know, a vendor may be awarded a contract in a council meeting. They then use that information to send an email saying, hey, I'm vendor. I heard that I won their contract. I want to set up my you know, payments for wire transferring. So here's the information, or here's our banking information. So they're using those type of tactics. We have to know that they're using those type of tactics so we can set up mitigation that works. And then whaling. And notice that the theme has been phishing, and then we say whales. And I know that whales aren't fish, but think of whales as a big fish, right? So what would whaling be? Well, that's when they target somebody at the higher level. An example is we got an email here that was sent to our CEO, and the CEO, it's basically, we're from the FBI and we have detected that there is cyber criminal activity in your organization. We don't think you're involved, but one of your employees is. We need you to call us and help us with it. And of course, you get an email like that, you should understand that's not the way the FBI works. They don't call you and say, hey, we think you're innocent. We're going to help prove that you're innocent and try and find the bad guy. No, they show up with warrants and they don't give you any warning, right? So those types of attacks should be clear, but not everybody, people still fall for this kind of stuff, right? So they're hitting the higher up levels. The executive management folks are a target specifically with trying to get them with fear. And here's one of our biggest problems. There is at least one employee who will click on anything. And when they do, that's just going to invite them in. It kind of reminds me of, you know, like the vampire movies, you know, in all the vampire movies and shows, they can't come into your house unless you invite them in. It's like the hackers. They can't come into your house until you let them in, right? You have to open the door. You have to unlock something. Well, all it takes is one person to let them in, and then it's too late, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So if this is one of the risks that you have, how are you going to address it? And see, the thing that the hackers understand is they understand that if they can get past your staff, they can get in, right? So they just got to figure out what is going to get somebody in your organization to click on something. That's all they need. And you think, oh, well, we're going to do our best to make sure it understands, because that sounds like that's a place, and we'll tell all our executives. Yeah, but the guy in the courtyard that you're not thinking about, he has an account that gets into the system. And once it's on his computer, then it can move from that computer to another computer. So you can't just say, oh, well, we'll just take the high target people and give them some training and tell them what not to do. You have to tell everybody in the city what not to do, right? Every one of those is a potential target for outside attackers. And so if they're the last, they're kind of their first and last line of defense. We need to give them the tools necessary to protect the castle, so to speak, right? They can't protect the castle if you don't give them anything. So we got to help them with that. So part of this, we have to evaluate the vulnerabilities we have. We should have an executive briefing with it. We need to look at what insurance levels we have. Is it going to be enough to cover it? A lot of cities now, the de facto standard that I've heard a couple cities talk about when they buy insurance for cyber is about $20 million. And they're basing that based upon what happened in Atlanta and what happened in Baltimore. Now, I don't know that every city really needs $20 million. Again, it depends upon the size of the city and how many systems you have, what the cost would be to replace. But you can see that they're starting to use those numbers that we do know as a basis for buying adequate insurance, right? Make sure your backups are good. Make sure you have an instant response process, access control inventory, email security, network security, obsolete systems out, patching those systems and making sure configurations are good, and making sure you have anti-malware in place and on all systems, even if anti-malware is in place on like 98 or 93% of systems and they still get hit. But without it, you're more likely to get hit. So those are some of the vulnerabilities. These are things we have to kind of look at. What's the likelihood? What do you think the likelihood is? Right? It made mainstream news, not just the industry specific ones, but it makes mainstream news. It's that cybersecurity breaches, not if, but when. So it's not if, it's but when. So here's the thing is that most people don't necessarily think of things that way. If I tell you, you are going to be a victim, you need to prepare for it, you're going to have a completely different response than if, oh, you might get hit. Well, no, you probably already were, you're already being attacked. The question is, maybe none of them have gotten through yet, but the attacks have been there, right? So what are we going to do about that? So the CEO of Atlanta says, hey, look, you can't necessarily stop all of your attacks, but you can prepare for the inevitable, and you can help reduce the impact by preparing for that. Here's one of the problems that we run into is that there's what we call security fatigue. People are tired of hearing about security stuff. And think about this. This is the biggest problem too, is that Target had a big, huge security breach. Big news because there was a big breach, right? Everybody heard about it. A lot of people at Sharp to Target had to get new credit cards, but none of us lost any money personally out of it. Target's stock recovered, so they're doing pretty good. So in the end of the day, everybody's like, well, it wasn't really that big of a deal to me. So what if there's a data breach? The problem, that's a data breach. That's different than ransomware, first issue. And two is the problem is people get tired of hearing about it and then they let their guard down. They just say it's not that big of a deal. And then they get hit with something like ransomware and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a big deal. So question, and you guys can fill out the answer in your box there. What do you think is the likelihood that your organization is a target? So everybody, you can go ahead and put in whatever your answer. I'm going to move on, but you guys can type in an answer. What do you think the likelihood is? Maybe do it from a percentage. Is it low, moderate, high, or is it 0 to 100%? Put out your ideas of what you think it is in there. I see a lot of people saying 100% already. So what's the potential impact? And we got some good ones. Someone says 50-50. Okay, fair enough. Potential impact. So what is the likelihood, what is the potential impact of what it can happen to the organization? Well, we have seen that in some instances that it's been a few systems that were hit and then organizations were able to recover relatively quickly. And other times it was debilitating to the organization to the point that they were not able to operate. That people had to go back to pen and paper, that they had to go out and buy printers to do payroll. You know what I mean? And then they had to cut checks manually. Those types of things that had to happen. So they had to go out and buy. Sorry. So the question is, how many typewriters do you have on hand in case of having to do things manually? Right. And without spell check, that's always fun, right? So we haven't taught people like how to spell things correctly the first time so that if you're typing, you don't have to redo it, because we have this thing called spell check and grammar check and all that kind of stuff. Going back to typewriters is not fun. And two, finding them is also not fun. And then finding ribbon for them is even harder. So that's a whole nother type of fun that you might have to have just to do something like payroll. So take those things into consideration and think of what the impact possibly could be. Wendy from IBM, she's a vice president of their threat intelligence portion of their thing. They said breaches are going to occur, but if you can limit the impact, you have a win. And I like where she's going with this, because we said not if, but when. The question is, okay, if you do get hit, how can you make it so that it's the least impactful to us? So there's a lot of things that we can put in place that will kind of help lower other types of mitigation strategies that will help lower the impact. So the likelihood we'll try to lower, but then also if the likelihood succeeds and then we got hit, how do we decrease the impact? So taking a look at those type of things. So when we think about that, we can look at things like how much it costs. Like, remember I told you about $20 million what people buying insurance, but do you know what the ransom was asked for both Atlanta and Baltimore? For the ransom for Atlanta was $52,000, and it cost them $17 million to recover. That's not a conversation I want to have with City Council as to why that was, why we didn't do what we needed to do to avoid all that, and all that good stuff. And the cost of the controls was probably not nearly all of that either, right? So had we did the mitigation up front, it wouldn't have cost us $17 million, and we wouldn't have to even be put in this situation choosing between 52 and 17. Now, when they made the choice from 52 and say, no, we're not going to pay it, we're going to go ahead and try and recover, they were thinking it was going to be about $2 million in recovery costs, remember? And then it ended up costing them $17 million. Baltimore, same thing, 76 to 18 million. And I put the whole numbers up there for a reason, because I could have said 17 million, all that. It's exponentially larger to recover. And so this, again, is kind of pushing, people to try and want to pay to avoid those things, right? So the U.S. mayors actually came up with a resolution to not pay ransomware attackers anymore, and yet local governments are still doing it. Just saying the resolution wasn't binding, but it was like, hey, we need to stop paying for that. And what we're now seeing is that when they used to ask $52,000, the bad thing is the bad guys now know that we're buying insurance about $20 million. We are spending $17, $18 million to recover. They know that, and they say $52,000 is not a big enough payday. So we need to start asking for more money. And so they've increased how much they've asked for. And recently, we're seeing things over $1 million now for the ransomware. And here's more bad news. Sorry, local governments, but you typically pay more. Why? Because your financials are clearly available online, so they know exactly how much money you have in the bank or you have access to or anything like that. So they realize that figure out a better price to give you in order to get you to pay more. So fortunately, you're paying 10 times more than anybody else is for the same ransomware, which is unfortunate if you are paying. So other types of costs outside of all of that, other than downtime, lost reputation. You have insurance deductible if you have that. Insurance premiums may go up. Legal fees may go up. Your bond rating may go down. On top of the recovery costs, any forensic costs you may have to make sure that they're out of there and not still in there. Instant response, in other words, somebody had to come in and do the recovery for you. All the overtime that your staff are going to have, any consulting costs, and the security controls that you didn't buy in the first place that you now have to buy, right? So those consulting costs and security costs that you could have spent up front to avoid, you're now spending after the fact. So the costs can get out of hand very quickly. And that's where you can see those large numbers of $17 million. So here's a question. And if you want to type something in there for your answer, that's completely fine. But how long can your organization effectively and efficiently operate without technology or data? So if your computer systems were all gone, how would you continue operations? Less than an hour, right? So this is where hopefully we're making that connection that this cyber risk that we're talking about is business risk, right? You can't complete your mission without computers and system and data. So if it is taken down, what are you going to do? Well, so what can we do to mitigate it, right? So I'm not going to leave you completely, although we'll talk about governance in the next section. So you get a process in place to make sure that you're monitoring and taking care of these things in the future. But what I want to talk about today is about mitigation. How do you, what can you do right now to fix these things? And so it's part of the problem, it's part of the solution. This is more the boots on the ground. This is what you need to do right now to fix these things. And then next week, when I talk about the governance side of things, I want you to understand that there's things that you can do to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future, that you're addressing all the issues that need to be addressed. And I think you'll get more out of next week's than this week, but so what can you do? First of all, learn from others. Work towards the best solution that you can. Prepare for the worst. and use the guidance that's available to you. So we actually made, so ransomware, Department of Homeland Security kind of sponsored this interagency report that kind of lists out a bunch of things you can do. It's not a very long report. It's not very exhaustive. It's a good place to start. They give you a lot of really shorthand information. And for the non-IT folks that read it, they say, oh, this doesn't look too complicated. But once you get into the weeds and actually try to say, okay, they said I need to have this capability. What does that mean? It gets a little bit onerous, but I will go over that to you. We have a checklist that we've combined everything that they had plus, and you go to our website, Maze Associates /ransomware risk assessment, and get it. And I think CJPRMA, they have it. I think Tony has it, and he can send it out to you guys too. I think he may have already sent it out to you guys before in the past. And it's basically compiling all the list of all the federal government recommendations. And it actually is not just them. It's that interagency guidance that came out. ISA, the National Cybersecurity Center from UK came out with guidance. NIST had some guidance. MS ISAC had some guidance, and there were some private industry reports and recommendations. And we compiled that all into one checklist that kind of asks all the questions. So we don't charge for it. It's free. You can download it. We've done other presentations on ransomware that you can find on our website and stuff if you need more information, or if your IT staff wasn't able to make it to this session, you can have them take a look at those things. So what you want to do from that, the idea is that you would want to go through that questionnaire. There's 80 some items listed. Each one of those is a control, is a factor in mitigating the risk. So you'd want to go through those and kind of see where you're at and then see where you need to go. We've kind of helped a couple local governments go through it. And one of the things that comes back is like, well, which one of these is the most important? Because I can't pay for all of this today. But which one of these are the biggest ones? One of the biggest ones that we found is something called multi-factor authentication. In other words, it logs in. Normally, you just type in a password and then you log in. Multi-factor requires that you type in a password and then you have to say yes on your phone, or you have to type in a number that's on a little fob that you have. There's a myriad of different ways that you can do multi-factor authentication, but that means that the hackers that are outside your organization cannot authenticate. In other words, it makes their job extremely difficult for them to try and break into your system. Because most of the time they just get somebody's password and then use the password. But if you have multi-factor authentication where you have to type in your password and then also on your phone say yes to it, they don't have your phone. So then that stops them from being able to get into your system. It is expensive. It's not a cheap solution, but it is the most effective solution out of all the ones listed. It's also probably the most technologically difficult to implement, given all the different types of systems that you may have within a city. And that's another thing that's kind of against cities compared to like a small to medium-sized business of the same size. Small to medium-sized business has one line of business. Cities, if you look at it from a business point of view, you have multiple lines of cities. Like Parks and Rec is completely different than, the Corp Yard is completely different than finance. You've got all these other different activities, police force, whatever you got going on. All these different types, you have multiple lines of business is basically what you have. And each one of them has their own needs. Each one of them, when they have their own needs, has their own risks, right? So we have to kind of address that. So anyways, when you look at the questionnaire, look at those types of controls and then kind of figure out how you're going to put it in all those different areas as well. You can run internal vulnerability scans. You can use our questionnaire to then kind of come up with a calculated risk. You should probably review your insurance to make sure your insurance is going to cover at the levels that you need it to do. And you can see here, Baltimore, this post that I had made, Baltimore decided $20 million in cybersecurity insurance based upon the fact that it cost them $18 million was what they were doing. And then we found one, what was it, the other one, this is Norwegian aluminum company that had it. they had only $3.6 million from its cybersecurity insurance, but their losses were $50 to $71 million, somewhere in that range. So they were completely not covered adequately enough. And I want to say, I think they went out of business. You'd have to look that up, but I think that was it for them. It was like bankruptcy of that. Obviously, local government is not going to go out of business. But it can have a significant impact on you guys. So do a gap analysis. Where are you and what do you need? And then try and start working forward to filling out all those controls in place. Come up with a list of remediation items and then create a report and then present that report to management. So if you're the IT folks, you want to give management this report telling them, hey, these are the controls that are recommended by all those agencies that I just had given you. And this is where we're at with all of those. And then management can make an informed decision. Again, they have to understand that there's this connection between business risk and cyber risk. If you're management, and IT hasn't come to you with any of this information, you should go to IT and say, hey, we've heard that there's this ransomware. What have you done for it? Here's a questionnaire that we've got that we've heard. These are all the things you need to do. Report back to me where we are on all of these items. And then have them come back. And then you can, so if you're management, be proactive because it is your mission that you're trying to protect. And if you're IT, be proactive and push the information up. That's kind of where everybody needs to be at this point in time. So I've taken this idea, so to summarize it, taken this idea of cyber risk management, and hopefully I've made the case to you that this is a business risk, not just an IT risk. And I've showed you how the normal risk management process can account for something in IT, the normal process that we would go through in any type of risk assessment, so that you can understand where you can get the information from and then how you can respond to it. And then next time, we're going to then talk about, on our next session, we'll talk about governance of information and technology, and where cybersecurity and cyber risk management fit in that framework, so that you can understand. The benefit of this is that you're going to be introduced, especially management, is going to be introduced to new concepts that you've probably read about and you've been told that you need to deal with, but you didn't know how to do it. So the next session, we're going to cover all of that. So you'll definitely want to tune in for the next one. We have a few minutes, so anyone have any questions? You can type them in or come off mute and ask away. Questions? Here's somebody got a doorbell. UPS is good.
I don't see any questions yet.
Yeah, I hear I hear type. I don't know if for me or for something else.
Владик, все, понятно.
Anybody have any questions? Here's one.
I see this one. David asked, does multi-factor authentication reduce or lower the impact of spear phishing? It reduces the risk of spear phishing because if somebody, it depends on what the spear phishing is for. If the spear phishing is an attempt to gain access to their credentials, in other words, to get their login information, it would eliminate the risk, or not eliminate it, but reduce. So one of the common attacks that happens is somebody will send an email telling somebody you need to reset your Office 365 password, and someone will click on it, they'll type it in, thinking they're resetting their password because the website looks like Microsoft's website, but it's not. That type of spear phishing attack, even if they got the credential, the password, it wouldn't work because of the multi-factor authentication. So can it lower it? Yes. But the spear phishing is asking somebody to forward all the W-2s for all the employees, the wrong email. No, it's not going to lower that one. right? So, so depending upon what the purpose of the attack is, the multi-factor will help reduce it. The biggest part that the multi-factor will also help with is if they did get inside your organization with some type of malware, that their movement inside of your system is extremely difficult if multi-factor authentication is in place. So it reduces the impact in that case. So the question somebody else says, is the security review or the questionnaire that I have from a year ago the same, and how do you recommend agencies revisit the survey? So it's the same. I haven't seen any new guidance from Department of Homeland Security or any of those other agencies on it. I've been monitoring to kind of see what some of the particulars have happened, the new reports about organizations hit with ransomware, and almost always it's still those same controls that were not in place that ended up for it. So, so no, it's still the same. Nothing else new's come out, but we're monitoring that. The next thing is, how do you recommend agencies revisit the survey? So one way that we do it, is if a client calls us and asks us to kind of help them with it, we come in, we go through the questionnaire with them, and then we create a report that they can then take to management, or we'll help them do the presentation to management. And basically we go through, it's much more detailed, obviously, the recommendations that we will then come up with, and then we use the information that we have from other agencies that were hit to kind of come up with a risk score. So based upon the controls that you have in place, and based upon the controls that these other places had in place at the time that they got hit, what is the likelihood that you might get hit? So we have some of that type of information that we add to the report. You can probably go out and try and find that information, but it takes a little bit of time to gather all that information up. But one thing that you want to do is, when we get to the governance part next time, one of the tools that they have out there is a GRC program. And what is that? It's a governance, risk, and compliance program that we use in cybersecurity that basically can track your progress over time. So you come up with a list of all the items that you do not have in place. That becomes a basis for a remediation plan. In other words, we're going to fix all these things. And then that plan is usually put into this dashboard that never goes away until you've actually done those things. Right? So it says you don't have antivirus on all your systems. So you need to have antivirus on your system. It's in your remediation plan. And then one day when it gets done, you click it and say, yes, we've implemented that. And then it takes it out of the list, right? The other part of the governance side of things is, the other thing you do with that is you reevaluate on a regular basis all those controls that you say are in place, and then test them to verify that they are in place. So you can have an external assessor come in and do that. You can have internal audit do it. You can have somebody in IT do it as a self-assessment. There's less a level of assurance if that's the case, but it's usually cheaper to do that if they have the skill sets and they auditing, or how to do an assessment, how to do an audit. So if they can do that type of thing, then they can do some testing. So use that as a guide for where you should be. And then when we talk about governance next time, you'll see that there's other types of standards out there that you should probably just implement those standards, because every one of the controls that I just gave you in that list, there's actually a control catalog of a list of all the controls that ought to be in place for a local government according to NIST. And you can use that as a gauge. Nobody's going to be perfect. Nobody's going to have 100% of all those controls in place. Know that it's a work in progress, but at least you know where you are, right? You have a dashboard, you would know exactly where you are, and keep track of it. Somebody has to be on top of it. Somebody has to monitor progress going forward, and always work, like in a quality assurance type of manner, always work to get better. So don't be mad at the fact that when you do one of these checklists, it looks terrible. Just start doing better. And just always do that. So hopefully that answers the question. Is there any other questions?
I don't see any. One more.
Oh, what are your views on California's version of GRC? So that's out of left field. So anyways, California's version of it, Unfortunately, California is kind of like taking the lead in this, where I think the federal government should have done anything, because it causes more problems than solutions. Because now there's like multiple frameworks that other agencies, or not agencies, but other corporations have to deal with, right? So how does Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all those big companies, how do they deal with California's versus GRC? This is all about privacy for all the other folks in the call that don't know what it's about. It's privacy law about what we're going to do to protect people's information. Now, California's latest version, I've heard multiple stories of whether or not local governments are included in that. I did talk to an attorney, and apparently, no, local governments are not going to be required. Yeah, GDRP. I knew what you meant. Sorry. Local governments aren't going to be required to do that. But here's the caveat with that. If you had a breach and personal information was in that breach, then you're going to have mad citizens who are going to be at a city council meeting raising a ruckus. And then what will happen is the state of California will come in and say, oh, we need to apply that law to local government. So if it doesn't apply to you now, you should probably act as if it does, because that would be the very prudent thing to do. So now that, so what should you do about that? Is California's versus GDRP? They're very similar in a lot of aspects, but some of the information is a little bit onerous on what you have to do. But I don't think it is for local government, because I think you'll have to go through the process and say, if we wanted to apply this, even if it doesn't apply to us, we have to have an inventory of all the personally identifiable information that we have. Do we have any health information? Do we have any? We already have other types of information that have statutory requirements like CJIS or HIPAA or PCI. So making this California version just is adding one more layer on top of all of that. What I think needed to be done is the federal government at a federal government level needed to come up with one standard that we can all follow for any type of privacy information, rather than, because now we have other states that are starting to enact theirs that are different than California's. Granted, for a local government, we don't care about what other states do. But now for all the organizations and the businesses that live within our cities, it's becoming more difficult for them. So what some of them have done is they will take the strictest interpretation of each one of those. GDRP, I think, has got probably some of the most strict items. So Microsoft follows their guidelines on all of their accounts. And then so when California comes up with their rules, for the most part, it's not going to be an impact to them. But for where it's different in the California's version of it, Microsoft's going to adopt the strictest. In other words, what's going to be the most private, what's going to be the best for the client or the customer as far as privacy is concerned. So that's what we're in these type of days, is where organizations are starting to have to do that. Local governments, we don't have to do it, but we still need to do something to make sure that we're protecting their information. So that's what I've heard. So your city attorney may say something different, but I've talked to two different attorneys and they said that is not going to apply to local governments. And then I talked to one and it said it did. So obviously they didn't all get the same memo. So, but I read the wording and it seemed like that's the way it's going to be. Any other questions? If not, then thank you for coming. If you have any questions, again, next week I'll be back on. So if you think of anything between now and then, you can always ask it next week as well.
Yes, thank you, Don. Yep. So everyone that signed up for this session, part 2 of this is on September 28th, 10 to noon in time, next Monday.
And thanks everybody for, I see a bunch of names that are familiar to me. Hi to all of you. Thanks, guys. It looks like pretty much everybody's out of here. So
Yeah, thank you, Don. That was great. We had about 30-some people.
that's
Yeah,
good.
that was good. Yeah.
How is the sound quality? Your sound quality to me sounds a little broken up, but somebody had said something about the sound quality. Was mine okay throughout the session?
Yours is okay. You probably are hearing mine like that because, you know, I have a dual monitor, and if I don't remember to unplug it, it creates that little feedback. Okay.
Okay.
Am I okay now? Like you can hear me fine now, right?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, somebody did mention that, but I'm not sure. Not sure what that was. I could hear you fine.
Okay.
He said
Well,
that it just kept on breaking every so often, in and out.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, perfect. All right. Well, I'll see you guys next week.
All right. See you next week. Have a good day. Bye,
You
Don. Thank you.